technology and learning can be fun together, but we also don't want the fun to overtake the learning as well. So this really kind of led me to develop this Triple E framework. And I started to think about where I could ground myself in understanding how we move students from just enjoying a device to actually really engaging and learning with a device. And as I mentioned before, I really came from a practitioner background. So I was someone who tended to do things by the gut, what looked good, what the vendors told me when I went to the conferences. And so what I started to do when I entered my PhD program was I really started to read about how students learn. And I started to read about how students learn with education technology. And it brought me back to these great thinkers, right? The Vygotskys, the Piagets, the Deweys, who spoke and researched a lot about different things that we know about learning. Learning should happen at kind of a higher cognitive level, and that it should be social. All of these things that we know are good practices in learning. And I started to realize that a lot of those good practices we weren't doing with technology. We weren't doing it in conjunction with technology. We were kind of throwing some of those things away and trusting the ed tech companies to know what the right pedagogy is. So once I started to really scour all of the learning sciences and how students learn with ed tech, I began to develop this Triple E framework based on this. And it really does come from the science of learning. So in this graphic, you can see that we have the 3 E's, engage, enhance, and extend learning. But what I've done in the Triple E framework, and you'll see that in a few minutes, is I went on to define them on how the learning sciences defines them, not how we like to define them kind of just by our gut. So engaging in learning with technology, how do we actually do that so students are engaging in the learning goals and not just the technology itself? Well, there's research to tell us what we should be looking for, and that's what each E has 3 questions associated with it. And then also we found that the instructional strategies really need to be there to support how students learn best. And I'm going to talk about how all of this kind of works together, but I wanted to give you a sense of this really was developed from the learning sciences, as well as a lot of good research around how students learn with technology and how they don't as well. So I'll be sharing some of that today. I wanted to ground it in TPEC. I use TPEC as a conceptual framework. I've used it for years as a conceptual framework with my pre-service teachers and in-service teachers that I work with. And before I started using the Triple E, many of my teachers struggled with TPEC because it's not really a practitioner framework. It's more of a way to kind of just ground ourselves in understanding the different types of knowledges that we would like to have in place when we're using technology and learning. And what I found was that the area that we seem to focus less on with technology and learning was the actual learning goals and making sure that our technology choices and our instructional choices were meeting the learning goals. We tended to focus a lot more on the type of use we were doing with technology, you know, whether it was substituting or transforming, but we didn't always focus on how it was actually helping students get to the learning goals. And we seem to focus less also on the instructional strategies that we are using when we are using technology. Again, going back to the idea of tech companies often sharing that, you know, you can just sit a student in front of a computer and you can walk away. And we know that isn't really how learning works. So the Triple E doesn't focus so much on the skill of technology or the type of technology. It focuses a lot more on what are the instructional strategies we're using in conjunction with technology in order to meet the learning goals. So I want to break down each of the E's for you and see how they work in this framework. I'm going to start with engagement, but I want to say very quickly that this is not a leveled framework. I know there are some frameworks out there that are leveled and you try to kind of get to the higher level. That's not how the Triple E works. All 3 of these E's are important and significant when it comes to students being able to learn best with technology. I'm starting with engagement simply because it's, I think, the word we tend to use the most when it comes to technology. I hear many teachers often saying, technology is so engaging for my students, or they're engaged by it. But I wanted to really dig into the research to find out what does it mean to engage students in technology to meet learning goals. So we're going to ground ourselves from one particular article. This came from Kathy Hirsch Pasek and Jennifer Zosh and a few other researchers that they worked with. This article came out a few years ago in Psychological Science and the Public Interest. And I love this article. It's called Putting Education in Educational Apps, if you have not read it. And what it really does is it really frames how we're using technology and how we're kind of missing the boat when it comes to making sure that we're actually using learning sciences in conjunction with technology. So they really weave these things nicely together. And all three of the E's are present in this article. So in this one particular paragraph from this large article hits on every single one of the E's that we're going to be talking about. So the areas I have highlighted are the areas of the E that we're going to be focusing in on. So for engagement, the things that we know about how students engage are they learn best when they're actively involved, their minds are on, engaged with the learning materials and undistracted by peripheral elements. They socially interact with others, and there's a clear, obvious learning goal and a well-defined learning goal. So this is coming from multiple pieces of research that Hirsch Pasek has put together. And so we're going to see how all of this fits nicely into our first E of engagement. So the first part of engagement is time on task. So we want students to be minds on the learning task, right? It's very important. So there's a lot of research out there around time on task and mind on the learning goal. So engagement is not time on the device, but it's time on the learning task. So one piece of research that's really helped me think about this is studies around students on task, off task behavior when they're doing a tech-related activity or any activity in class. So this is a piece of research from a couple years ago looking at kind of the average third graders on task, off task behavior when they're asked to do an activity related to technology. And as you can see here, after about 10 minutes, the average third grader kind of loses their focus on the activity itself. And furthermore, the more they do the activity, so for example, if it's like an adaptive piece of software where they're supposed to spend 20 minutes a day on it each day throughout the school year, by mid-school year, 10 minutes is way too much as far as off-task behavior is concerned. That number starts to lower to maybe 6 or 7 minutes before their mind starts to wander. And I will say I see this actually at home right now with my son who's in 2nd grade, because he does Lexia. And at the beginning of the school year, he loved Lexia. He would ask to use it all the time. And now, just yesterday, I kind of forced him to use it. And after about 4 minutes, he was completely zoned out and not at all even trying. He was just guessing, clicking and guessing throughout the whole software. So it really reiterated this particular study. Now, these kinds of studies on task, off task behavior, if we know that the average third grader is about 10 minutes, average high school students around 15 minutes or so, how do we use that information? Well, we want to think about breaks. One of the things that the research points to is that it's important to take breaks from technology or switch gears within the technology itself to keep the students' minds on the task. So we can encourage students to just completely disconnect from the technology, go to a recess, do some stretching and yoga exercises. We can also encourage them to reflect on what they've been doing with the technology, like a think, pair, and share, or visible thinking routines, and then go back to it a few minutes later. And just a couple of minutes of that will help to recharge their brains and give them opportunities to really reflect on what they're doing. The other option is to switch gears in the technology. So if I'm a high school student and I'm researching something, maybe take 10 to 15 minutes to do research and then have the teacher instruct them to move over and do some analysis of the research they've collected or curated. So just switching gears a little bit also helps them to kind of recharge their brain, or give them an opportunity to share out through the technology, through like a Mentimeter quiz or something like that. So keeping those types of things in mind is part of engagement. The second piece of engagement that we know is that the technology should not distract from the learning process. And technology, as wonderful as it is, does have a lot of distractions built into it. And this is you know, there's been some great research about how educational apps sometimes are not designed well and end up being more distracting than beneficial. Um, uh, and so one of the things that we want to keep in mind is what are all the things that could be distracting in an application. And we don't have time today to go through all of the things that tend to distract us, pop-ups or avatars or other things, but they're in there and we want to really be mindful of those things. So one example of that would be the rewards. There's been some good research about the actual rewards over the last few years. And what the research has found is that all these stickers, badges, avatar shopping, that's my daughter's favorite thing to do, is shop for those avatars and earn outfits for them. They tend to actually be counterproductive to students focusing on the learning goals. The only kind of reward system that they seem to have found to be productive for the learning goal is when games allow students to master a level and then the reward is you level up or you unlock the next level, because they've actually showed that they've mastered skills in a particular level. So, you know, people who game design and understand learning sciences would say, you know, focus on mastery and leveling up more than stickers, badges, and avatars, and try to avoid systems that have too many of these rewards and distractions. And then a couple of ways to think about supporting kind of this minds-on learning with technology. When we look at it through the lens of the EEE framework, we either are looking for an application that has strong pedagogy that helps the students focus on the goal and guides them towards the goal. I have a couple examples of software in that visual, some PBS software from Sid the Science Kid, which helps to guide the students and kind of scaffolds them towards the goal about weather, or the FATE interactive simulations that kind of guide them into doing different scientific simulations. Or if the application doesn't have strong pedagogy, but you still want to use it, make sure you use careful instructional strategies around the technology, such as those breaks for turn and talks. Interactive modeling is a great thing to be able to do with technology to teach them how to think as they use the software, visible thinking routines, shorter time on technology activities. So if it's not built into the software, it doesn't mean you can't use it, but it means you really want to think about these careful instructional strategies you want to have around it. The last area of engagement is the fact that learning is social. And if you've ever seen me present, you will not be surprised at the next slide. And it's because my guessing is that you are all high-level educators. You know that learning is social. And for some reason, so many tech companies create these very isolated pieces of software and not a lot of social or reflection is built into them. So on this slide, we have two images. Both images of families engaging with media, one from 1958 and one from present day. As you're looking at these images, what are you noticing as you compare and contrast the two with their engagement in media? What are some things that you're noticing? And I'll look at the chat room here. Lots of good discussion going on in this chat room. You know, I'm looking at the chat and I just want to go off a little bit of a tangent on that. Is I'm noticing the chat around the Khan Academy, and some are noticing it as a positive and others see it kind of as a little bit of a negative. And a lot of that seems to come down to the instructional strategies that are placed around how the teachers are asking students to use it. So that really plays into this idea of how important instructional strategies are. And not as important is the actual tool itself. Not that it isn't a useful tool, but that those instructional strategies make a big difference. All right, so I'm looking at the comparisons now. She's smoking, Kevin, yes. Let's see, individual engagement instead of social engagement. There is one kid that is not looking at TV. Let's see, everyone is engaged with their personal device in the later image, yes. present day has a very kind of individual use approach to it, right? So we could look at the present day picture and say, this is, you know, personalized entertainment, right? You no longer have to fight with your sibling about what show you're going to watch or what game you're going to play. Everyone can do their own thing, right? They don't have to worry about negotiating that. And you can go deep into what you want to do. But in 1958, everyone kind of had to engage in the same media together. Is there a benefit to having everyone engage in the same media together? Also known as, also called co-engagement, which was coined by the Sesame Project back in the 60s. Yeah, Ed, it's a shared experience. Yes, Melanie, shared experience, right? When we have a shared experience with something, we're building community, we're building understanding. If you remember, well, you may not. I went to school in the 80s, and I remember my teachers wheeling in like a television with a VHS tape, and they would play the you know, whatever it was, the Nova special or whatever we were watching. And then they would stop it sometimes. There was always that teacher that would pause it and then have a discussion and then unpause it. And of course, as a student in the classroom, I was like, oh, just keep playing the video. But the truth is, I understood much better as we had this shared discussion about what was going on in the video than when we were just doing something very isolated. So when you are co-engaging in media, whatever the media is, a game, a simulation, a video, whatever it might be, you're able to have the same content experience. You're able to develop a shared understanding. You're able to work through misconceptions, because sometimes we understand things differently or don't understand something, and it's easier to talk through when you're having the shared experience. When everybody is doing their own thing with their own separate content, one of the dangers in education is that as an educator, if I don't know the content because everyone thing is so personalized, then I can't help them work through the misconception as well as if I had experienced that content with them. The Sesame Project found this to be true when they were studying families and children watching television, that having these kind of co-engagement experiences and shared experiences were really beneficial cognitively. It's why we ask, you know, children to read together with their parents, and it's also why we should be asking children to do technology with their parents, right? Play a game with them, do an app with them, not just isolated and alone. So we're looking for opportunities to create this kind of co-engagement type experience. So even if you have a one-to-one school, not everything has to always be one-to-one. It's fine to be 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. And there's a couple of different ways that we can make sure technology is really supporting social learning. The first is using applications that encourage co-engagement or co-viewing. You know, applications that allow you to synchronously work with others like we're doing now, right? The other way is to use instructional strategies around the technology to encourage reflection on what's happening within the technology itself. So different reflection activities, partnering students, so having them work together on their IXL, or having them work together on an adaptive software. One of my former students who now teaches in Detroit found that in Detroit, they're required to use iReady, an adaptive software, for almost 60 minutes a day, which is quite a bit of instructional time. And her students were really struggling with it, and they were struggling on different pieces of it when they were alone. So she decided to kind of break the system and allow them to work with a partner, and they do turn and talks, and they do teach alouds and share with each other what they're doing and what they're learning as they're working through their iReady. And that's had a very positive impact on them. So I've already seen IXL mentioned in here, so I appreciate the preview of that, Elizabeth. And IXL to me is just an example of a piece of software where it is set up to be kind of individual and one-to-one. And so with software like this, students sometimes might struggle in the software. They might end up doing the guessing, which happens a lot when it's one-to-one software. So this is where we would put in those instructional moves, like I had mentioned earlier, like the guided modeling, interactive modeling, think pairs and shares around the software. So it's not that you can't use one-to-one software, we can, but we want to make sure we have those instructional strategies around it. The other choice, of course, is to choose things like maybe Google Docs, where we can have interactive conversations in the comments around what we're seeing in the Google Doc itself. So it's another way to have kind of a synchronous conversation or collaborative conversation. So again, looking for software that allows you to be kind of to co-engage through the software can also be really beneficial. So this brings us to, oops, I think I accidentally clicked on my link. This brings us to the 3 areas of engagement: time on task, minds on the learning goal, making sure it doesn't distract from the process of learning, and the fact that learning is social. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us out to the EEE framework, and we're going to remember back to the case that we had just watched. Here is our website if you haven't used it, EEEframework.com, the link's in the slides. And we're going to go through the first 3 E's, and we're going to answer the questions about the case. So remember, our case was, it was a PowerPoint. The learning goal was visualization. And what we're going to do as we go through each of these E's of engagement is we're going to replace the word technology with the actual tool, and we're going to replace the learning goals with the actual name of the goal. So for question 1, does the PowerPoint help students focus on visualization with less distraction? And in the chat room, you can just put an A, S, or N if you think absolutely it does, somewhat it does, or it does not at all. So does the PowerPoint help students focus on the learning goals with less distraction? All right, I'm seeing a lot of somewhats. And so I would say that you are in kind of, this is a somewhat to absolutely. I don't think the PowerPoint is distracting in any way from the learning goal. I think that, you know, the teacher has like some very pointed images in there. So I would say this is somewhere between a somewhat and an absolutely. So our majority said somewhat, so we'll go with that. The second question, does the PowerPoint help to motivate students to begin learning about visualization? So does the PowerPoint help to motivate students to begin learning about visualization? Again, you can say absolutely, somewhat, or not at all. I'm seeing some absolutelys and some somewhats. So again, yeah, with the pictures, absolutely with the pictures, right? So again, you know, we had the PowerPoint allowed them to see some of the images that they were trying to predict what they might look like. So it was definitely helpful in that. So it's somewhere between a somewhat and an absolutely. So we'll say somewhat. And again, if you put absolutely, that would be fine too. Does the PowerPoint cause a shift in the behavior of students where they move from passive to active social learners? So this is really asking the question about, is there social learning happening, and are they active in their learning? What do you think about this one? So I'm seeing a lot of not at all. So I'm seeing a somewhat, not at all to somewhat. So they're not active in the PowerPoint, I agree, right? Like it's not student-centered PowerPoint, interactive technology learning, but I would argue that there is social learning happening in this small group. I would argue that while it's not happening through the technology, they are socially having conversations about what they're seeing and noticing in the technology, and I think that that is beneficial. So I would argue that the answer would be somewhat. It's not absolutely in my mind because they're not actively learning, but there is social conversation that's happening. And remember that social can happen through or with the technology. So I'm going to say somewhat in this case. Now we're going to move over to enhancement. And in enhancement, we're going to see what the research says about enhancement. So hold on, again, hold on to our case study. We're going to come back to that, I promise. Right. So enhancement, again, going back to our article by Hirsch-Pasek and Josh, just keeping in mind that enhancement is really about making sure that students are interacting cognitively in a high quality way, and also that there's scaffolds and supports that are put in place around the learning that is happening with the technology or in the technology itself. So you have high cognitive activity as well as scaffolds and supports. So the first part of enhancement is this concept that learning with technology occurs when students are using their high cognitive skills. So I don't think this is shocking to anyone that, you know, we're thinking about the upper levels of Bloom's, and even noticing in our ISTE standards that we're asking students to use some of these higher cognitive skills, such as knowledge constructor, innovative designer, you know, creative communicator, those types of skills. So it's great when we can employ that with technology. We also know that our students in general don't learn as well when it's drill and practice. And so many educational apps are focused on drill and practice, which is unfortunate because a lot of research just points to it's just not that effective, as we know. And in particular for at-risk students, like in this Stanford study, where they looked at at-risk students, they found that when they were using higher cognitive skills with technology, there were benefits, but drill and practice, there were not benefits with that. So 2 ways to think about how we can support students with higher cognitive thinking and technology. One is to choose an application that encourages higher level thinking. The second one is if you don't have an application that encourages higher level thinking, then you can again use instructional strategies around that tool. So if they're doing IXL, which is drill and practice, then you can have them do questioning activities or problem solving around it, or think pairs and shares to reflect on what they're doing to still get to those higher cognitive skills. Have a paper next to them and have them actually writing through and working through the problems. So just kind of one example of something we want to be thinking about is we want to think about what type of cognition the application is asking students to use. So here's 2 pieces of math software. Dreambox, which is an adaptive software. If you've used that before, it's mostly kind of drill and practice. It has kind of little tutorials in it, but it's mostly asking students to focus on lower cognitive skills. Whereas QThink, which is also a math piece of software, actually allows students to kind of work through the problem solving process of mathematics, to kind of record it, to ask teachers questions, very interactive, and it allows for students to get to some of those higher cognitive skills. So depending on what your learning goal is, you want to be aware of the type of cognition the software is asking students to use. The second part of enhancement is that we know learning with technology happens when technology helps to make the learning easier. In other words, putting in scaffolds and supports. It shouldn't make a concept more difficult. I've definitely seen people use technology where they're trying to replace something, like they're trying to replace Romeo and Juliet with like a robot, and it's actually making it much more difficult to understand Romeo and Juliet. So we want to make sure it's actually making it easier to understand. So a couple of different ways that this can happen to have scaffold supports differentiation occur. One is, of course, choosing applications where there's some differentiation and learning supports that are just built into it. The second one is, again, if there isn't learning supports and different kinds of scaffolds built into it, we can build scaffolds around it. We can make mentor texts, we can add in voice and choice, we can do some different types of guided practice to help them think about what they should be doing with the technology itself. So for example, software that has some scaffolds built into it, these are just a few examples, thinking about different ways you could differentiate as one example of kind of scaffolds and supports. We have things for Lexia levels, or the fossil record actually is differentiated to different reading and learning levels. Or we have things that have templates built into them to make it a little bit easier. So thinking about, you know, how tools can actually build some of these supports in. The third level of enhancement is this kind of value added question. Learning with technology should add value to the learning goal. It should not be something that if you can do it on paper and pencil, do it on paper and pencil. We know that's a lot easier and a lot quicker than pulling out all the technology to do it. So we always want to think about, if I had traditional tools, what would I be doing, and how is this enhancing what I'm doing? How is this adding benefit or adding value to it? Asking that question. So I just want to give an example of a lesson that I think adds value. This is Alyssa Marcangello. She's a teacher in outside of Detroit. She teaches French. She's a K2 French teacher, and every year she has a learning goal about students being able to compare and contrast Parisian culture with their own culture. She can't take her students to Paris, unfortunately. So she's always done a read aloud of the book called A Walk in Paris. And for this read aloud, usually she would just read it aloud and they have lovely illustrations. But then she discovered Google Earth and found that you could drop that little pin man into any location in Paris, these museums, marketplaces, restaurants, and you could drop that little pin guy in there and they could really compare and contrast a street market in Paris versus the Eastern market in Detroit and see the visuals and get a 360 view of them. To me, that is definitely an added benefit and an added value over what she was doing traditionally. It's still teacher-centered, but she's creating a lot of discussion, doing a lot of questioning around it to still get her students to that higher level of thinking. So this to me is a good example of just because it's teacher-centered doesn't mean it's bad use of technology or it's ineffective. It's actually very effective for her learning goals and what she wants to do with them. So enhancement is really about these concepts of getting students to the higher level thinking skills, making sure that there's some scaffolds and supports to help support the learners, and making it easier to understand something. And then how is it adding value beyond a traditional tool? So let's go back to the EEE framework. And let's look at the enhancement questions. Again, I'm going to replace the word technology with the technology as well as the learning goals. So the first question, does the PowerPoint aid students in demonstrating or developing a more sophisticated understanding of the content? So in other words, are the students getting to their higher level thinking skills in this lesson? All right, I'm seeing somewhats, lots of somewhats. I would agree with that. I think that, you know, they are definitely having a deep discussion about the visualization and the mummies and the tombs. So yes, evaluation is happening. I agree with that. So, and the PowerPoint is kind of helping with that, right? The teacher's doing a lot of good moves with it too. Yeah, I give a lot of credit to the teacher there. The second question, does the PowerPoint create scaffolds to make it easier to understand visualization? So is the PowerPoint making it easier for the students to understand visualization? I'm seeing it absolutely. Somewhats and absolutelys. Yep, I would agree with that. I agree with the somewhats and absolutelys. I think that, you know, this is a case where the PowerPoint is helping to kind of make these things come alive for the students so they can see what the mummies actually look like, or the tomb, or Peru, and the location. And then finally, does the PowerPoint create paths for students to demonstrate their understanding of visualization in ways they could not do with traditional tools? So the way I like to think about this is I always say, what would I be doing traditionally if I didn't have the technology? So traditionally, I probably would have taken the pictures and printed them off and maybe put them on my desk in front of me, right? Or maybe held them up one at a time. So is the PowerPoint doing something beyond that? What do we think? I'm seeing some no's, no, no. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you. I don't think this is really adding value beyond that. I agree. I think the teacher had a rich discussion, but maybe it's not adding value beyond that. Okay, let's dive in briefly to our last E, which is extension. Extension's my favorite of the E's, if I'm allowed to have a favorite, because I love that technology now allows us to go from like 6 degrees of separation to 1 degree of separation. I think that's so cool. So technology extension is really about connecting the learning in the classroom to students' everyday lives. And I think technology has so much potential for that, making the learning, making it meaningful and relevant to the students themselves. So the first part of extension is that learning with technology should be accessible 24/7 outside of school. This one really means the tools themselves. So this really takes you down to the nitty-gritty of the tools. Choose tools and apps that are as accessible as possible so students can go home and replicate the work. If you're using something that is proprietary to just your school system or cost a lot, it does make it prohibitive for the students to be able to utilize that in their everyday lives. Very simple as that for the first piece. The second piece is that technology should bridge school learning and everyday life. This really gets into a lot of the research behind, you know, Brown, Collins, and Do Good and how students learn. But, you know, technology should help to bridge school learning and everyday life. And this is also the concept of transfer. There's been a lot of studies on transfer and finding that students can't always easily transfer what they're doing with technology to their real world. But the research has found that when a human demonstrates a technology or when a human demonstrates a new concept, students can transfer that much more easily. So that tells us we have to make our use of technology as human as possible, as real as possible, so it's easier for the students to transfer. So one example of that is this teacher here. This is Eric Robinson. He's a second grade teacher. He's wonderful. And he used to use the screencasts that came with the software package. So whatever their textbook had, he would use those screencasts with their students to do things like everyday math. And he found that they were struggling with taking up the concepts. So he started to make his own screencasts for the students to do at their math centers. He would include activities like the score of the football game from the Friday night. He would include jokes that the class could relate to. He would include pauses for them to stop and reflect. He made it very human so that they could take up the learning much more easily, and the transfer would be easier. So bridging school learning and students' everyday life can occur with technology in two ways. One is to choose an application that has everyday life experiences built into it. The second one is, if they can't do that, which is hard to find those, is just kind of use purposeful moves to bring in student everyday themes around the technology. So students being able to bring in their passion and interest, having some choice and voice in what they're studying and looking at, sharing images from the community, sharing community problems to solve, making it as realistic as possible through the technology. And this is just, to me, a really great example of an application. If you're familiar with Nicole Pinkard's work from Northwestern, I love her. Years ago, when she was at the University of Michigan, she created a software called Say-Say-O Playmate, which was based around kind of African Americans in urban areas in the schoolyard, where they would play kind of the hand clapping games. And so this whole software, it's a literacy software built around these hand clapping games and making it as real as possible for the children who live in these areas. And then one other example, just checking my time here. One other example is Sheila Orr. She is a high school math teacher, and her learning concept that she struggled with or had was that she wanted students to solve problems involving right triangles using the Pythagorean theorem. And she also wanted them to be able to communicate mathematical understanding about the Pythagorean theorem in their real world. Not easy to do for a high school student. So what she did was she came up with this project around the ADA compliance, American Disabilities Act compliance in school, and ramps. And ramps, they had just actually changed the specifications for how ramps would be compliant or not. And so the principal wrote the students a letter and said, can you measure and see if our school ramp is compliant, and tell us if it's not, how to fix that. So the students used technology. They used GeoGebra, and they measured the ramp, and they found out whether or not it was compliant, wrote a letter to the principal letting them know that actually it wasn't compliant, and these are the changes they needed to make mathematically in order for it to be compliant. So making math as real as possible with the technology to assist that. And then finally, the last area of extension is this idea that learning with technology should build kind of these soft skills and build on prior knowledge. So we know that we want students to have soft skills. The question is always what soft skills, because those kind of change over time. So I actually like to use the Partnership for 21st Century framework. I like that they go out and they actually research business and industry to find out what soft skills are necessary. And I try to use those as kind of my benchmark for the soft skills that I want students to be able to develop. So when it comes to extension, these are kind of the three areas we're looking for. So I'm going to jump back over to our framework one more time. Good question about the 24/7 access. I'm going to try to come back to that in just a minute here if I have enough time at the end. It really does. It does include after you leave school as much as possible, but you know, there are some exceptions to that. Obviously, the LMS is something that you're going to have to work within and work from. So the first question of extension is, does the PowerPoint create opportunities for students to learn outside of their typical school day? This is the question of, do they have 24/7 access to the PowerPoint tools? What do we think? Somewhat, yeah, it really depends on if they have, you know, the Microsoft Office application. I would say somewhat to no in this. Yeah, Christy's saying, I don't know, somewhat to no. I would probably say not at all, honestly. It's just not that accessible to many, especially depending on your demographics. Does the PowerPoint create a bridge between school learning and students' everyday life experiences? What do we think? Or I should say, does it create a bridge between school learning and their everyday life experiences around visualization? Not a whole lot, right? Somewhat, not a whole lot, somewhat. Do they have a mommy at home, right? So not a ton, although there were some everyday real world experiences brought into it, maybe not their own. So we could say somewhat, I guess, for that. And then finally, does the PowerPoint allow students to build skills that they can use in their everyday lives? I would say for me, this answer is kind of a somewhat, because there is some collaboration happening. There is some evaluation. There could be more, I think. So let's see what our ultimate score is here. I wasn't counting as we went, so I'm not actually sure. See, we ended up with an 8 out of 18. So what we know about that, if we just look at the evaluation system, is we're kind of in this mid-range. The mid-range pretty much tells us that when our lesson is scoring in this range, that there are some positive things happening in this lesson. And we know that because the teacher has some good, strong instructional strategies, but we could either change the tool and or change and modify some of these instructional strategies to make it even stronger. And what we want to do is we want to look and see, where are we strongest? So engagement was fairly strong. We ended up with a 3 out of 6. It could be stronger, but it wasn't too bad. Enhancement was also a 3 out of 6, so about the same. And then extension, there's not a lot of extension in this lesson. There's not a lot of connection between the real world and what the students are doing. So what we would do then with our students, our next step is really to think about what changes would we make? So these are just some suggested changes that I have. These are just a couple suggested changes that I have of what I might encourage a student to do. And some of these were already mentioned, I think earlier by, I want to say Kevin mentioned one of these, maybe using Google Earth instead of the PowerPoint or Google Cardboard to actually really see a 360 view of these places. Or maybe using the Google Tour Builder in conjunction with the PowerPoint to build your own tour. I think that would alleviate some of the issues of enhancement, really giving it a value over the traditional, and some of the other pieces that we were missing here as well. So we want to think about, what could we do instead? Change the strategies, change the tool. We know the research is clear that the strategies really are going to make or break the lesson. So I have a couple of resources that we use for strategies at U of M. One is on the EEE Framework website. There's some suggestions, and also in the books. But also, I really have fallen in love with the Learner Variability Navigator on Digital Promise. The link's in the slides, where you can go in and look at the strategies. They actually have a video of how to do the strategy, and they have great suggestions as well. So I'm a huge fan of this, to kind of just come up and generate different strategies and ideas with my student teachers and my pre-service teachers as we're looking through those. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that the EEE framework has been validated. Sheila Schatz from University of North Texas did a really nice independent study on it to make sure that it was actually valid and reliable. So the information on linking to that is in there as well. And I think I'm right on time. So if there's any last minute questions, I'm happy to answer those in the chat. I apologize, I didn't get to more of the chat comments, but I appreciate all of them. And you have my email address in the opening slide, so you're welcome to email me and contact me with any questions you might have. Thank you so much for joining me today. I was thrilled to be here. Denise, thank you for the invitation. And please do contact me and reach out if you want to talk about any of the work that I've shared in here. And thank you to everyone who's already using the framework and has put in some very kind remarks as well. I appreciate it.